into our discussion about T.S. Eliot and one of his most popular poems, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And just to be honest with you, T.S. Eliot is one of my absolutely favorite poets. If you take American literature or if you take British lit, you're going to find that T.S. Eliot will show up in both of these. And the reason for that is Eliot was born in America, but he later went to England, and he was part of the Lost Generation. And that was a term utilized by Gertrude Stein. And there were several members who were kind of classified as the Lost Generation. So you had T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and T.S. Eliot did in 1927 give up his American citizenship and become a British citizen. So he is one of the Lost Generation members who did totally give up his American citizenship. His writing will feel very, very British. So if you're familiar with British literature and just some of the styles that are used at this time, it's going to feel probably a little more British than American. All right, so if you are following along with me and you have the Norton Anthology, the 9th edition, I will be on page 355, but I'll actually be listing out line numbers on this lecture because I have another edition that is heavily marked up, and so I'll be walking through this poem on line by line. This is one particular poem that if you have read this poem and you walked away confused, that's totally normal and that's okay. So let's walk through this poem together, and hopefully this will provide some clarity for you, and you'll totally get this at the end. So it'll be a piece of cake. All right, so before we start breaking this poem down, there are a few things that we should discuss about Eliot and his writing styles. First of all, Eliot was highly educated. He attended Harvard. He is not dumb, okay? And his grandfather also helped found Washington University in St. Louis. So his family was very well educated. He was considered a high modernist. He likes to deal with subjects like the decline of civilization, the decline of modern man. He will always deal with love in some aspect usually, but sometimes he takes a more negative stance on love within his writing. And this is something that we're going to see within J. Alfred Prufrock. He is also, he uses heavy allusions in this. He alludes to biblical texts, to Latin texts, Greek, and his attitude about that is pretty much like, well, if modern man can't understand all these Latin and Greek references, then, I shouldn't have to explain it to them. So that was kind of his attitude in terms of writing and using allusions like that. Also, it's important to keep in mind that in 1927, Eliot not only gave up his British citizenship, or gave up his American citizenship and became a British citizen, but he also went through a sort of spiritual conversion as well. He joined the British Church and the Church of England. And that also sort of produced a shift in his writing. So if you notice any of his writing prior to 1927, some of it will have sort of a heavy feel to it, and it's almost depressing, and he's dealing with modern man and the decline of civilization. And you'll notice he'll start writing some more spiritual poems like The Journey of the Magi in 1927 and onward. So you'll see sort of a shift in his writing in 1927, okay? All right, so let's start at the beginning of the J. Alfred Prufrock poem, and let's work towards breaking this down for you, okay? So first of all, this is a love song. As the title indicates, this is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but we don't really know who this poem is being written to. So that's something that we can kind of debate about. Who is he writing to? Who is J. Alfred Prufrock in love with? And we don't really know that. So he begins by referencing Dante at the very beginning. So this is a Latin reference written at the very first of the poem. It's from Dante's Inferno, and he doesn't even translate it for the reader. And it's sort of seen as, like I said, his snobby way of saying, you should understand this, and if you don't speak Latin and you're not smart enough to understand this, then, I'm not even going to go to the trouble of translating this for you, okay? Um, so he opens up with one of the more popular lines in this beginning, and actually several references within this poem are some of the most well-known lines of 20th century poetry. He begins by saying, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells." Okay, so we're in sort of a seedy town. That's what we know thus far, and we have one person encouraging the other one to go somewhere. Okay, so you may have heard those first two lines. Let us go then, you and I. And you may have seen those on even book bags or T-shirts. Those are pretty famous lines, and it's sort of this beginning of a dramatic monologue. We have this character who is contemplating a lot through this poem, okay? And he says that he's like a patient etherized upon a table. So essentially, this is modern man, and modern man has become numb. He's a patient etherized upon a table. He can feel nothing. And this is sort of our society. So this is Eliot saying, this is the modern man. This is kind of the best we have going on right now. And this is our society. He also, in about lines 6 and 7, discusses one night. He talks about restless nights and one-night cheap hotels, sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. So one-night cheap hotels, we have lust, but we don't really have love here. We have oyster shells, which are sometimes viewed as an aphrodisiac, or referenced as such in literature, but we also have a shell. It's a hollow food, and you'll notice some hollow aspects throughout this poem as well. But all of these things going on the streets, the hollow food, the one-night stands in hotels, all of this is leading us to one thing, and this is the overwhelming question. Okay? And there's much research about what that overwhelming question is, and we really don't know. But our reader sort of tells us not to even ask what it is. So lines 10 and 11, or around 10 and 11 here. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead us to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask what it is. Let us go and make our visit. So like Dante and Virgil at the beginning of the Inferno, they begin their descent into hell, if you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, which is the first installment of Dante's Divine Comedy. So it begins with the Inferno, Purgatory, and then the characters progress into heaven or Paradiso. So we have J. Alfred Prufrock, and he and you and I here. So he and one other person, or he's speaking to the audience or the reader. We're going to make a visit, and we can kind of assume that his visit here is to this city, and he's about to paint us this underworld, or this picture of this underbelly of a city, and we're sort of, in a sense, descending into hell, but we're also being given this view of a modern city. So Eliot is essentially saying that the modern world, the modern city, is kind of a version of hell. So about between lines 10 and 15, there is this one line that you're going to see repeated throughout this poem. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Okay, so we're kind of not really sure if these women are sophisticated and they know what they're talking about. Are they educated women who know about Michelangelo? But they come and go. So are they educated, or where are we? Okay, so keep in mind the descriptions that Eliot is giving us about this place, about this underworld that we're sort of seeing. Many critics think that these women are actually prostitutes. So the women who sort of seem highborn, they're coming and going, they're flowing, And many critics believe that J. Alfred Prufrock is in a brothel. Okay? All right, so line 15, Eliot begins by talking about yellow fog. And the line below that, he talks about the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes. The yellow fog, the yellow smoke, lets us know that we're actually in London. And Eliot is describing London. Okay, so around line 35 and 40, between 35, 40, 45, we're getting sort of a look inside of the mind of J. Alfred Prufrock. And we sort of see this image of a man who isn't very confident in what he is or who he is and what he wants in life. So he begins by saying, and indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare and do I dare? He's second guessing himself. And remember, we have this overwhelming question that we don't fully have answered, but it's in the back of his mind at all times. Do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to my chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted or by a simple pin. So he's sort of a trend follower. We're getting a description of his necktie, how it's just inserted with this simple pin, his morning coat, but he's second guessing something, and it's almost like that time, if you ever go through a moment and you are trying to decide what to wear to an event, and you go back and you change clothes multiple times. This is sort of what we have here with J. Alfred Prufrock. He's questioning his appearance. We get an idea of what he's wearing, but he's even questioning himself in terms of entering the room, how, he's going to descend the stair. So we don't really know if, there's criticism on both sides that potentially he's entering the room and there's this lady that he's in love with, or we're back to the brothel. He's in a brothel, okay? And he's really unsure of himself and self-conscious. And about line 45, he does not want to take risk. He's very scared of risk. So he says, do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. So he's questioning everything. He doesn't want to take a risk on something. And he starts to sound sort of like a broken record throughout this poem. Also, about line 45 through 50 in this next paragraph, he says, for I have known them all already, known them all. And he's talking about the days. So every day that passes, it's just kind of a day after day after day. He's got his routine going on. He's known the evenings, the mornings, the afternoons, and I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. So by measuring his life by coffee spoons, he is essentially living each day coffee cup to coffee cup to coffee cup. So each morning he wakes up, he has his coffee, he measures out his coffee, whatever he puts in his coffee, his sugar, his cream, and that's essentially how he's measuring out his life. He's doing the same thing, his routine, over and over and over again. And he doesn't, again, like to venture out. And so at the end of this paragraph, or the stanza, he's saying, so how shall I presume? So he's having sort of a hard time entering different rooms here. So he's kind of questioning, how do I presume? How do I go about this? All right, so one technique that Eliot and many of the modernist poets utilize is fragmentation. And in fragmentation, you'll see glimpses of maybe an image or portions of an image. You won't get the whole. And in Eliot, we're still searching for meaning. We're searching for meaning, but sometimes we're getting glimpses of situations or even images of people. And around lines 60 through 65 through 70, so 60 through 70 really, we have this stanza where Eliot is describing the women, but we don't get a full image of these women. We don't get like a head to toe description of any of these women. He says, and I have known the arms already, known them all. Arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl, and should I then presume? And how should I begin? Okay, so we don't get a description of the women, we get a description of their arms and their hair, but we really don't get a full image of that. And so we're getting fragments of a whole, but we're not getting the whole here. And we also are, there's this search for communication, and we're seeing communication sort of break down. So about lines, 68, 69, he says, and should I then presume, and how should I begin? So, I'm searching for a way to speak to these women, or I'm searching for a way even just to enter the room, but I'm overthinking and I'm not really confident about it, and I'm not really sure how to go about this. Another motif that we get in this poem is time. Okay, so we remember he's measuring out his life by coffee spoons. He's talking about there will be time and time enough in life. Not only do we have time itself and the evenings, the days, the measuring of that, but we also have time in relation to a lifespan. Around lines 111 and 112, he references Hamlet. Keep in mind that Eliot is very well versed in the classics, in Shakespeare, and so he's referencing Hamlet, and he says, "No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Am an intended lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two. Advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool." Okay, so he's referencing Hamlet, and in Hamlet's famous to be or not to be speech, where you may have seen him holding the skull up, he's really saying to live or to die. It's not always what we think of it as being, okay? So he's really kind of in this moment contemplating suicide. So is life really worth living? Was I meant to be? And according to J. Alfred Prufrock, he's also contemplating this as well and does not feel that he was necessarily meant to be. All right, so we have in the back of this poem this overarching question that's still existing in the back of J. Alfred Prufrock's mind. So what is this question? Well, we'd all like to know that. But we see this question still occurring throughout the text at various moments. So if you look at lines between 75 and 80 of the text, he said, we have J. Alfred Prufrock saying, "Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis?" So should I have the strength to ask this overwhelming question, to do whatever it is that I am contemplating doing or asking, this overwhelming question that has been plaguing my mind after we've had tea? Maybe I'll have the strength to do this, okay? He goes through this, and again, this will resurface throughout the text. Between 105 and 110, he says, "Would it have been worthwhile if one, settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning towards the window, should say, 'That is not it. That is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all.'" So after he has asked the question, he fears rejection. So maybe someone's going to say, "No, that's not what I meant at all. That's not it." So, and then lines 120 through 125, during this time he's talking about growing old. When he grows old, shall he wear his trousers rolled up? Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? Shall I walk white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach? I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. Okay, so he's contemplating things that we as a reader would probably say this really doesn't matter. He's talking about when he gets old. Should he wear his hair parted a certain way? Or should he eat a peach? What should he really do? And some of these we think you're not really contemplating important questions in life. You're contemplating some questions that we probably would say don't really matter all that much. But he's talking about also hearing the mermaids singing, and this is again or Eliot referencing Greek and Roman mythology. And in Greek mythology, the sirens were these beautiful mermaids who would sort of entrap or enchant men and sailors, and they would become so engrossed in the singing that they would wreck their ships upon the rocks. And this is something that you'll see in the Odyssey. And if you take the route of viewing these women that he is discussing throughout this poem, or Eliot, as prostitutes, the sirens are representative of the prostitutes, that they are beautiful, they are enticing to men, but they can also cause them to wreck their lives. All right, so line 125 of your text. We have J. Alfred Prufrock saying, I do not think they will sing to me. And keep in mind here that he's referencing the mermaids, and the mermaids are representative of the prostitutes. And he's basically sort of saying that he has very little self-confidence, and he has this overwhelming question he wants to ask, but he doesn't feel that, he is, on the level that even a prostitute would sleep with him. He feels that he is so low that they won't even sing to him. He won't, the prostitutes here, the women who are coming and going, talking of Michelangelo, they're not even interested in him. All right, so the last stanza of this paragraph, or of this poem, about line 130, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea-girls wreathed in seaweed red and brown till human voices wake us and we drown. So he's painting the brothel that he is in. If you take the brothel route viewing this poem, he's painting the brothel as a sea, and he has been surrounded by these mermaids who are calling him and enticing him. And we have this image of seaweed being red and brown, and we have this view of their hair being like seaweed. But he, like society, kind of going back to how we began this poem, he's just numb. And society, J. Alfred Prufrock, as this modern man, is numb. He doesn't feel anything. And eventually, human voices, some sort of reality, wake us from this numbness that we're in, and we drown. So this, what we thought was reality, we are awakened by reality, and then we die. Okay? All right, so if you need sort of an, in a nutshell, summarization of J. Alfred Prufrock, we have this character who is incredibly unsure of himself. He contemplates things that really don't matter on the grand scheme of things, but he is a modern man in the modern world, and essentially the modern world is being painted as a type of hell. And he finds himself in a brothel and surrounded by all of these women who are enticing and beautiful, but he has this overwhelming question, and we're not totally sure what this overwhelming question is, but we can kind of safely assume that he is going to approach one of these women to ask them to sleep with him. And he is very unsure of himself, and while he is contemplating things that may not matter in the grand scheme of things, when he gets old, will he part his hair a certain way? Will he wear his trousers rolled up? Will he eat a peach? He's not really sure. But while he's contemplating those questions, he does not seem to have the gumption to ask the overwhelming question of, will you sleep with me? And he views himself as being so low that even a prostitute will not sleep with him. So even these mermaids, the prostitutes that he he references Greek and Roman mythology, and calls these women mermaids. Even these prostitutes will not sleep with him. And this is our, presentation of modern man, the modern world, by T.S. Eliot. And all right, so I know this poem probably came off as super encouraging and uplifting, and you're all dying to go read more Eliot poetry, but I do hope that breaking down this poetry or portions of this poetry provided clarity for you, and I hope that it does make you want to read more Eliot poetry.